Radio, where gamers roll.
www.d20radio.com.
Hello, Gamer Nation, and welcome to the Dice Pool Podcast, covering everything that you've ever wanted to know about how to run and play in the GeneSys Role Playing Game by Fantasy Flight Games. I'm your host, GM Hooly, and this episode we have a spooky topic to discuss as we celebrate All Hallows Eve. Whether it be a little bit late, but that's all right, here on the Dice Pool Podcast. But for the moment, let me introduce you to the people who I'd feed myself to zombies for, just so that they could escape to fight another day. My co-hosts and friends, GM Huzz, GM Flano, and GM Kaitlin. How are we all?
I'm doing pretty good.
Yeah.
Foolishly well.
What was it? Foolishly well?
Yeah, it's pretty accurate for life. My life in general.
Very good. So how was everybody's Halloween? I know that we don't really, retail would say otherwise, but we don't really celebrate Halloween here in Australia.
Well, I celebrated it by keeping the door closed, ignoring people knocking on the door like a grumpy old man.
Which is pretty much your every weekend.
Yes.
Like, let's be real. There was no changes for you.
I predict I'm about 2 years away from being that guy who yells at the kids going past. That's
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
No, just stand on the veranda and throw, lollies at them. Like, just peg them.
No,
as long as you're not the one that puts razor blades in there, I think.
No.
Jeez, that's a bit
I'm
horrible.
giving them
what's more
candy
terrifying
here.
than razor blades and
By
candy?
force.
That's pretty terrifying.
And so how was your Halloween, Kaitlin, since this is the first Halloween while you've been over in the States?
Yes. So my workplace, the new place that I've just recently started working at, does Halloween games and lots of fun activities. So that was amazing. I dressed up as a creepy little girl because I managed to find in one of the these giant Halloween stores that they have here, which is probably my favorite store ever, except even though they're only pretty much around once a year. But I managed to find this really cool bear that it starts talking about how you never play with me anymore, and then it rips off his face and it's got blood and skeletons underneath. So I did a costume based around that of a little girl that was dead and, with her little toy running around. So that was a lot of fun. And yeah, I just generally really enjoyed it considering it was a work day here and there was lots of little kids that came to the front door and we had our giant inflatable dragon at the front. And yeah, it was a really fun night. I really enjoyed it.
Very cool. Well, I just put up a sign. I was a bit like Mike. I put up a sign and says, no thanks, no trick-or-treat, because I'm really tight when it comes to, spending money on candy to give to children.
Well, I had a friend on Facebook who was very excited by the fact that she gave...
Sorry, hold on. You're really tired of spending money to give candy giving candy to children. How often are you giving candy to children? That's a financial burden for you, Ian.
Never. Absolutely never. That's the whole thing.
Poor Ethan.
Although Ethan really, because we didn't do it, Ethan basically has gone, oh, Dad, can we go to the IGA, which is like a convenience store over here in Australia? And they've... I've said, right, here's a credit card. You go in and get something. $50 later. It's just like, wow. Man, that's just like way too much candy. So that'll do us for the next month.
Try a week.
Week? It's really going to last that long?
Everybody's seen the size of me. Yeah, probably a day, maybe. But anyway, moving along.
Yeah. I did a really great impression of a plague victim this Halloween.
Really?
Because I was really, really sick.
Oh,
So I didn't get to participate in anything.
He was the illest.
Bit of nerdle happening. So, Mike, you were telling us. Sorry, you're a friend of yours.
Yeah, I had a friend on Facebook who was put up a post about how much fun she had on Halloween. I was like, oh, yeah, cool, whatever. That's their thing. But instead of lollies or candy, she gave away school pencils. I'm like, if I was a trick-or-treater, and I was given school pencils,
I'd throw it in the bin.
I'd rather the grumpy old man come out and throw rocks at me. At least that's an interesting story to tell.
No, because she's broken the trick or treat compact.
Exactly. Pencils don't cut it.
They're not treats.
If you're going to celebrate Halloween, then you have to celebrate Halloween and everything that comes with it. I think trick or treat is just too thrown around now. It should be the trick or the treat. You got to decide. Pencils isn't a treat.
Until the kids decide to go mental and just like start stabbing you with pencils.
They have been watching a lot of
they
John
throw
Wick, so.
toilet paper and TP the house.
Right. Very good. All right. So, what gaming stuff have we been up to? Obviously, we've been doing a little bit of festivities, but what sort of gaming, Mike?
For me, usual bits of role-playing, bit of L5R. It's been somewhat quiet in the RPG sense the last couple of weeks. I think L5R and Dark Heresy were the two games that I've participated in. I was GMing Dark Heresy, if that could count as participating. I suppose it does.
Yep.
It's kind of critical.
It is. However, I did lose all my notes prior to the session.
Oh.
So due to my writing software not saving it for whatever reason, because I think the cloud didn't synchronize. Just technology and Australian internet don't work. But it was okay. We nonetheless, we still managed to have a fun session, and lots of killing and murdering happened at high seas, which was a bit of an interesting thing for Dark Heresy.
Oh.
Other than that, been playing a lot of tabletop Battletech. Well, and playing is probably the wrong word. I've been sourcing miniatures, because finding Battletech miniatures that aren't a million years old and in Australia is very difficult to do. So I've reached out to various other sources for miniatures, and I've been getting things from Russia, Poland, all over the place. Sourcing.
So you have Russian miniatures?
I do. And it was like the email I got to like approve the miniatures coming was by the Russian dude, and it was written in really broken English. If you read it with a Russian accent, it sounded like legit Russian. And the guy's name was Vlad as well.
Oh, that's amazing.
It was just made it even more authentic. I mean, he's either embraced the meme that he's Russian, or yeah, it was quite good.
Yeah.
Cool. Martin, what's the gaming you've been up to?
Not much. I've been pretty sick.
Yes, I've been very unwell.
He's been the illest.
Playing video games. Spider-Man, which I still haven't finished yet. No, I haven't got Red Dead yet. Like, I'm
That's
finishing
really
the games
depressing.
I've got.
No.
Tried the BattleTech mod.
Rogue Tech.
Yeah. Similar to the XCOM Endless War sort of mod. I've gone bankrupt several times now.
In real life or Rogue Tech?
Rogue Tech.
Damn it, I've gone bankrupt again.
Yeah. So, yeah, I've been having fun with that.
I declare bankruptcy.
I was just about to quote that from The Office. Love it.
Right. I haven't seen
You have to do more than just say it.
Wow, you've not seen The Office? No. Don't worry, neither have I. Well, sorry, we've just lost half of our fan base now. So.
Well, that's the thing. Office is a bit of a it's a segregated community, because you have the British Office fans,
Right.
the American Office fans. Like, I don't mind the American Office, but to me, the British Office is hands down the best. It's the dry cringe humor, which is just phenomenal. That only Ricky Gervais can do in his comedy, and it's fantastic. I watch that, and Life's Too Short maybe 3-4 times a month. So month? I meant week.
Very good. Kaitlin, what's the gaming you've been up to?
So I've been up to a lot of Red Dead since it came out, and I have been super excited for that game. And the fact that now it's in my hot little hands, have just been thinking, dreaming about being in the Wild Wild West, and I've been loving it. I haven't gotten too far into it, but I'm doing pretty well for myself. I'm currently sitting on about $2,000 just sitting in my bank account, which is pretty nice. I can afford whatever I want, which is good.
To put that in comparison, I'm sitting on $50 in Red Dead, and that's because I've chosen a life of crime, and crime doesn't pay all that much.
Right.
Because, Anyway.
But see, I got most of my fortune from robbing a bank, so it's just got to get good.
Rip.
But yeah, I've been pretty much living and breathing that whilst working and all that boring stuff that life calls for. But did have an amazing game of Dark Heresy, as Michael's talking about. He said he lost his notes, but we didn't know any different. It was super fun. I did my typical Kaitlin rolls, which meant I botched most of them, but that made for some pretty interesting role play with the demon that has been trapped inside my character coming out and having a bit of playtime in terms of ripping off people's heads and pushing them with telepathy and all those types of fun. It was actually a really good session.
Wow. And that's using GeneSys, yeah?
Correct.
Nice.
Well, speaking of, me and Martin were discussing last night about, because by default, Dark Heresy doesn't have stim packs.
Oh, okay.
Which makes combat pretty brutal because you just can't instant heal.
Yeah.
That's not to say you just can't just chuck them in from GeneSys. That works, but we've decided to go a different approach and not use stim packs to see how it feels. But me and Martin were discussing last night of using, what do we call it, a fatigue level and...
fatigue for strain and...
compromise? No.
Well, it was like compromise from L5R, but I forget what we called it. Incapacitated?
Incapacitated, that's correct. Basically, if you go over your wound threshold, you still function. However, you add an automatic failure to every check you make.
And yeah, if you hit with anything, you take a crit just as normal.
But the difference is you don't go down, you're still up. But you gradually get more and more battered. And when you hit double your wound threshold, you are dead. No two ways about it, you will die. And that adds a little bit of more grimness to the setting, I guess. But at the same time, there's never really a moment where a character is just knocked down and out of the fight for the entire session.
Yeah.
So,
and strain worked similar. Except you got an automatic threat to everything that you did.
But that's we've been sort of brainstorming that.
We haven't tested it yet.
Okay.
But seems like an interesting concept.
I did certainly test what it's like to get knocked out and go below.
But get back up again?
Yeah, I did. You're never going to keep me down.
To continue the pun. Yes. Great. Lovely.
Luckily enough, I had a whiskey drink. I had a cider drink.
Oh, dear. So, as far as the sort of gaming that I've been up to, I've thrown my hat into the old D20 ring, which is, I didn't think I would, but I got invited by a friend of mine who I haven't seen for a while.
Did you have advantage when you threw the hat in?
No, I did not have advantage. It's one thing that really sort of does my head in, is when you roll the D20 and go, well, where's my threat and advantages and triumphs and despairs?
No, you succeeded or failed.
Well, succeed or fail, and that's all that you can tell me. But look, I thought originally that it was just going to be starting campaign, and he said, "Oh no, we've started a little bit higher than that." And I've gone, "Okay, cool. What am I looking at? Oh, 16th level. Ah, right. Okay, so."
That's a mess to try and craft a character at.
Well, so I've decided to go hardcore and went a wizard.
That's even harder. What are you doing to yourself?
I don't know. I'm thinking of, baptism by fire, I think.
Well, at least 5e does make it a little bit easier.
Look, it does. It's, ultimately, for me, it's more about the social aspect.
Yeah.
I'm dealing with a group that I haven't seen for quite some time, so it was good to catch up. But yeah, it's not GeneSys. So, just saying. But a lot of fun was had, so that was cool. Also been doing a little bit of Blood Bowl, doing some more conversion for my Legacy of Fire conversion for Terranoth, and that's been a lot of fun. I think I'm ready to go with the first adventure, so when we get a chance. And then we've also been doing a little bit of L5R as well. So, yes, I've had my fill of gaming. So, yeah, it's all good fun.
Speaking of RPGs,
yes.
I did receive my copy of Shattered.
You did?
Which I put an image up on our Facebook page.
Yep.
But I haven't, I'll be honest, I'm one of those guys who will buy a book by the pretty images inside, so I will judge a book by the cover, and that's just the way I roll. But either way, it's the artwork in the book is fantastic, and that's what hooks me in. But the setting in Shattered looks fantastic, and it's only just literally come out. I think it's available for the public, at least via PDF, so if you look it up, you can't go wrong. It's grimdark, mage punk fantasy setting with a bit of a twist. Has a lot of similarities to Knight's Edge, which is purely by coincidence. But yeah, check it out. It's definitely not GeneSys, but variety is the spice of life.
Cool. Well, talking about Mage Punk, as part of our commitment to the D20 Radio Network, we'll be highlighting one of the podcasts in the network that we think you should give a listen. So, Martin, what's our podcast spotlight for this episode?
Well, D&D 5e is one of the most popular RPGs in the world, and the setting of Eberron remains one of the most intriguing and fan-loved settings ever made. D20 Radio's own Eberron Renewed podcast is a brilliant actual play podcast with weekly episodes that chronicle the adventures of a wily band of misfits trying to save the world. The group is engaging, hilarious, and the stories they weave are something any GM or player can learn from. So check out Eberron Renewed. You can find it and many more great shows at d20radio.com.
Cool. Eberron Renewed. It's I'm playing catch up. And it's been going for quite a number of years now. So just to try to get me into that D20 mindset. So Eric does a really, really good job. So check it out. Now, speaking of the D20 Radio Network, have you heard about Gamer Nation Con, listeners?
No, what is it?
Gamer Nation Con.
Please tell me more.
Well, this is the best little con on the planet. It has around about 250 to 300 attendees. So if you haven't gone to Gamer Nation Con in the past, it's a 4-day gaming convention, and this year it's being held in Plano, Texas, between the 4th to the 7th of April of 2019. 19, sorry. Yes, 19. And this year the Australian contingent of epic proportions will be there assaulting the beaches in the form of the Dice Pool podcast, with all of the hosts making their way to the show, which is very, very exciting. So, yes.
Every time I hear Plano, Texas,
yes,
I think you're saying plain old Texas. I'm like, oh man, I hate to be those guys right now.
I was thinking of a plane full of Texans.
Oh, that too. Anyway, it's terrifying.
Oh dear.
But don't let me hold you up. Please tell me more about this fabulous con.
So
they will be storming the beaches of.
We will be. So how do you get tickets, I hear you ask? I'm glad you asked. Kickstarter is the only way to go by searching Gamer Nation Con 6 and look for the blue superhero banner. And don't forget, if you can't go, you can still become a backer and get access to the vault of games and supplements available to those who attend. And more importantly, there is a special level for the Dice Pool podcast where you can get into a game with at least one of the hosts.
Don't do it.
Of the show. So go check it out. So should we get into the spooky topic of tonight, boys and girls? Or girl?
I think you mean ghouls.
Ghouls.
Yes.
The boils and ghouls. Lovely.
Oh,
Accurate.
Yes. Core of the show. Welcome to the core of the show, the segment where we will take a deep dive into a topic concerning the GeneSys Role Playing Game, and of course, gaming in general. And I was actually dared to do that, but anyway. So
you didn't count anything.
I don't recall that.
What? We've got 4 wonderful hosts. Anyway, so tonight. So why do I do this to myself?
Host. 2 hosts.
1 host.
3 hosts.
Yes. So tonight we're going to be exploring, as you can probably guess, we're exploring the horror tone. So if it goes bump in the night, oozes pustules and blood, and has the potential to send you mad, then this topic is going to be the one for you. So before we get started, let's set the groundwork and discuss the horror tone rules, which, for those who are following on at home, can be found on page 242 of the core rulebook. Mike, would you like to kick us off?
Sure. Well, I guess if any tone rules, there's no hard and fast rules for it. It's more of just a guideline. Horror is unique sort of setting. Well, not setting, tone, I should say, because you can plug it into anything. You can play a Star Wars horror game. You can play a Western horror game. You can play a Terranoth horror game. You can anything you think of, you can potentially make it horror. Now, horror isn't, necessarily all about, blood and guts and stuff like that. It can be more psychological, which a lot of games do really, really well. GeneSys does incorporate horror rules, but that's the horror rules that it incorporates are more for the side effect of playing a horror game. What will happen to the players when they do inevitably encounter horror. Horror in a setting, I feel anyway, I can only speak for myself, can be a fairly tricky thing to inject into a game because horror, because we're sitting at a table with pen and paper. So you as the GM really have to emphasize everything and make the horror really, really ingrained into everything that happens. Because if it's on a surface level, most of the time players aren't going to really get spooked by it or find much horror in it.
Yep.
So you need to find ways to sort of tackle it and bring it down to a psychological level, I guess, to the players. And that can be a matter of finding out what their characters' desires, ambitions, and etc. are. And GeneSys, fortunately, has a great motivation system, which can be a fantastic stepping stone for using them as horror assets. You know, use them against the players. But then again, you also got to take into account if your players aren't really attached to their characters, they're not going to be too worried about what you do to the characters' motivations. So it does come down to the players you have at the table as well.
Yeah.
So the players, if they know it's going to be a horror game or a horror-themed adventure of a game that exists, your players should also get into the mindset this is going to be horror. Because if the players let that mindset sink in, the horror can potentially find a deeper spot in their brains. And
You need to have
chills.
that buy-in, right?
Exactly, it's that buy-in. And horror isn't necessarily for every GM because some people's minds aren't wired up for a more horrific thing, and what one person finds scary, another person might not. So that's sort of the pitfalls of horror as well. What I think is horrifying, someone else might just laugh at or find it much more disturbing. So just like your buy-in, you have to establish with the players what's cool as well, because you can go too far of horror. And if everyone at the table isn't comfortable with certain themes, you might upset some people. So again, it's that groundwork. Make sure you establish what people are comfortable with. Now, if you're lucky enough to have a long-term group, you probably know what they're comfortable with anyway. But yeah, just that's about it. Like I know when I started my Dark Heresy setting, Dark Heresy is, grim dark horror. Horror is a part of it. I had to make sure that everyone was okay with potentially pretty dark themes. And I said at the start, if anyone finds anything uncomfortable, say it and we'll change it. Don't sit there and think that we're not going to change the story because you're uncomfortable with something. Now, fortunately, I was playing with people who are fairly chill with everything, so that's okay. But, different players, different people, different aspects of life, I guess.
Yeah.
But yeah, so horror is interesting because it does require a fair bit of you as a GM knowing your players and knowing their characters. The better you know your characters, the better you know your players, the better you can scare them, essentially. I ran a Star Wars game not too long ago for a bunch of players, and it was basically Star Wars Cthulhu. And by the end of it, the players said to me, I'm glad that's over because I'm so stressed out. So... And it'll had added effect because they went into thinking Star Wars. So this is not going to be full of horror. But then it turned into a complete horror nightmare fest for them. And that sort of helped add to the effect because they were in a setting where they weren't expecting it. And that's a bit of a twist you can do with horror as well. You chuck it into a setting where you don't expect horror to come running along, and then all of a sudden there's horror. And people aren't ready for it because you're just dropping them straight into it. Now that goes against what I was saying before, making sure players know the horror is there. But if you know your players and what they're comfortable with, chuck it in randomly. Dusk till dawn. When everyone saw that for the first time, no one saw the vampires coming.
Not even a little bit. Yeah.
But yeah, it's interesting what you can do with horror.
But keep in mind that if a player expresses that they're not comfortable with something,
take it seriously.
Go with that. Yeah, take it seriously.
Yeah, because that sort of stuff, as you say, Matt, Mike, it does need to be discussed in session 0 before you start. Having said that, when you're wanting to run it in a game that people aren't sort of expecting it, you want to be able to sort of suddenly, to get that shock value more than anything else. If it's just like a one shot or something like that, how do you handle that?
Well, it's cool to do that sort of thing, but you just need to check in with your players.
Sure.
So after you've had the big reveal and you've gone through that, check in with them. Make sure that they're still on board for everything and that they're okay to continue.
True.
Yeah, as I said before, it's one of those things, if you're fortunate enough to really know your players, you can probably bypass
Yeah.
that step. And that was the case for me. I was lucky enough to know the guys on a personal level. So I knew what they were cool with and what they weren't cool with. So I had no trouble just throwing it in because I knew the guys. But if you're playing for a new group of people, be very certain that you check what's okay, because some people can get disturbed by things much more differently to other people.
Yeah. It comes down to the relationship you have with your players.
Exactly. And before I mentioned using motivations and et cetera to work against your players and use that in the horror. In this particular Star Wars one, I'm only using that as an example because it's the most recent horror thing I've run. I got the players, because the players, we started off the adventure, because this is maybe session 2 or 3, I can't remember. And the entire campaign isn't horror themed at all. It's just my particular adventure was. And we started the session in a long hyperspace voyage. So I had the players basically give me a montage scene of what they did during the journey. And they all basically discussed in character what their characters' ambitions and etc. were. And the players thought, well, cool, this is us just diving deep into our characters. Little did they know I was taking all those ambitions and dreams and desires down, and I then later used that against them. And it worked really, really well because it's still fresh in the players' minds because they developed that with one another at the table only an hour beforehand.
Yeah.
So I was able to really manipulate everything in that scene or that adventure because everyone had just come up with it. So I was there on the minds, and suddenly I was using their characters' dreams and ambitions as pure horror against them, and it worked really well. So that's a big key factor of it. Know your characters.
I just wanted to add on to that as well, is that when we think a lot about horror, we tend to think of like supernatural themes, or we think of demons, or we tend to think of the more stereotypical type of horror thriller type of settings. But it's also important to remember that GeneSys has really given us really cool ways of adding horror or just even fear to our role-playing games when we actually create our characters. And I know, Michael, when you first started talking about it, you talked about, well, you have to have character investment, but when you're creating your character, you do have your motivations, and one of those key ones is fear. And those fears could be being alone, or it could be heights. It could be something so super mundane that is so specific to that character that can really add that horror element to that individual character. Doesn't always have to be whatever goes bump in the night. It can be something that is incredibly specific to what that character's journey is or what that character's background is, and can really add that next level of fear depending on what that character is going through in that current time. Like just heights, for example. So you're walking over a bridge. You happen to know that character is afraid of heights. Super mundane to everyone else, but for that character, it could be a really pivotal moment for roleplay.
That's very accurate.
Very much so. Because I guess that horror, as far as the tone goes, has almost two parts to it. There's horror and then there's terror. And I was listening to another podcast, not on our network, but they were talking specifically about L5R. And
I'm sorry, what? You were listening to a podcast not on our network?
Oh, I know, right? Bad
I
me.
I don't understand. It mustn't be very good then.
Well, you're never supposed to listen to it anyway. That's the that's the Order 66, absolutely. But you've taken it to the next level.
I have taken it to another level.
I have just stopped listening. I have become one of the meme.
But they talked about the difference between horror and terror. That horror is, horror can be like the physical sense, the things that go bump in the night and whatever else. But the actual terror can be the psychological side of things. Because it's one thing it's kind of like the Alien film, that we don't actually see in that film, we don't see a lot of the alien. Because it's the power of the unknown that is the driving force behind the terror of what is happening on film, and that's what's so a little bit more scary.
I like to think of horror as the thing that's crawling under your skin. You can't see it, but you can feel it.
Oh, yeah, okay. That's disturbing. Cool.
But then you've got shock value and things like that are completely different. But
sure.
And that does go back around to full circle to what I was saying. Horror can be anything that's not just, it doesn't have to be spooky, supernatural things. It can be, as Kaitlin just said, it could be completely psychological, mundane psychological things.
Yep.
What it comes down to is how well you can inject that horror.
Exactly.
And how well the players adapt to the horror. Because it can be easy for players to step back and go, well, I'm not scared of this. But the characters might very well be.
Absolutely.
But it gets a fine line, though, because in some adventures, you could be the big damn heroes. You shouldn't be necessarily scared of everything, even though you as a person might be scared in that situation, but your big action hero character might not. So there is a lot of nuances to how to role play horror too. So there's a lot of levels to it. And it does come from a setting by setting sort of basis.
True. Now, GeneSys gives us the tone, the horror tone, as I mentioned before, and it sort of breaks it down into two sections. It talks about the fear side of things, and then it talks about the sanity side of things. So, Martin, would you like to take us through the fear rules?
Absolutely. So, fear has some interesting rules. So, fear is a powerful mechanic that can be used in your games. Basically, every trigger, I guess, for fear has a rating of how much that impacts the players. And it's typically, from easy, average, hard, daunting, formidable, much like everything else in the game.
Yep.
And then you use that rating and you roll usually discipline to resist the fear. The mechanics here tell us what happens whether you succeed with advantage or succeed with threat, or if you fail with threat or if you fail with advantage, and how to apply that in your games. You can, in fact, run away screaming like a little girl. That happens. Or you can be frozen to the spot, rooted in absolute abject terror of the thing before you.
Right.
Like all good horror games. So if we want to quickly run through those effects of fear,
sure.
We've got the suggested effect for failing or generating threat or despair. You've got aversion. The character is unnerved and distracted and is disoriented for the rest of the encounter. This is a good penalty for simple failure. So that'll give you a setback on everything you do.
Yep.
Adrenaline rush. Momentary panic gives the character a rush of adrenaline, but at a cost. The character adds boost to their next check, but suffers 3 strain, which is a good penalty for success with threat. And you got the typical flee in terror, which is a good penalty for failure with a small amount of threat or even a despair. Frozen in terror, which is for failure with a lot of threat or despair. And when you succeed, though, there's steady nerves, which is the character keeps their nerve and suffers no ill effects, which is good for if you just simply pass. There's also stand with me, and any allied characters forced to make a fear check from the same source add a boost to their check, similar to the regular expenditure of boosts. But you also have fearless. This is a pretty good one, and it's typically used for if you succeed with triumph. And basically, they automatically pass any further fear checks from that source for the rest of the session.
For the rest of the session, yeah.
Now, it's important to reiterate that these are more or less examples.
These are examples. You can always apply anything else you want to a scene. But keeping in mind as well that you don't want to get stuck using these rules for these are not a crutch in order to inject horror into your game.
That's
sure.
These are to show how your character is affected by fear. So if you've introduced the sound of scratches on the wall and things out of beyond the edge of your sight, and the players are getting that creep factor on, and you can see that they're being affected by that, you might call on them to make an average fear check. And if they fail, one of them might start running, or one of them might, break down and cry. Whatever. This is a way to show how that horror that you've already injected into the game affects them.
It's interesting too because I guess it's a fine line of trying to work out how often to make these checks.
Yes.
Because if you're in a horror setting, you could potentially say you could be making horror checks every 5 minutes, every new monster that appears in the room or whatever the horrifying situation is.
Yep.
So I would reserve these checks for like maybe once every significant moment.
Significant moment.
Tension builds to a moment and then it sort of bubbles over and a check's required, or something surprises the players, like they mind their own business walking along in a park and a monster jumps out. That's probably a good time for a fear check.
You could also go to the extent, just talking about what you just said there as far as going through a park, that you want to add that another level of tension, I guess, that you are walking through a park by yourself and you're in a horror setting, but you've got absolutely no intention of having a monster jump out.
No.
But you still make them make a fear check.
Well, especially if that character has listed their fear as
Parks.
or being alone.
Or being alone, yeah. I was going to say that's oddly specific, parks.
Hey, it could be.
It could be a phobia, sure. We'll get into
Or
that
owls.
in a tick. Yeah, or owls,
Yeah.
sure.
Well, it's interesting as well because when we're talking about horror, it's as much as about what the character's perspective is than to what is truly terrifying. So as you were saying before, it's not so much the possibility of, yes, something is definitely going to jump out at you, but the potential about how that character is feeling in that particular moment. Like nothing might happen, but they could still be terrified. They could still feel fear.
Absolutely.
They could still be worried or anxious about what's going to happen. And that adds for really cool role-playing moments where it's just like, how many times in the beginning of a horror film do you have someone that hears a snap of like a twig and it goes, oh, no, it's nothing. But you still had that moment of adrenaline and fear of what could have happened.
That's right.
And that's it. This reinforces the setting rather than defines it.
But I will play devil's advocate here and say you don't feel obliged to make the players make fear checks all the time.
No.
Absolutely.
In the we use it as an example in the Star Wars horror game I ran, I didn't make a single player make a fear check. The players were role playing that well that they were role playing their characters' fears out, and they were genuinely stressed out, and that was showing what the characters did on screen really, really well. So there was never a moment where I called for a fear check because honestly, I was waiting for an opportunity to pop up to make that fear check role necessary. It just never occurred. Yeah. And if you feel that the situation is running smoothly enough where the players are genuinely spooked or the characters are role-playing being spooked really, really well, and you feel there's no need for that fear check, don't force it. Because a character who could be role-playing being scared, and it's good role-play, passes his fear check with, a million triumphs, it's suddenly almost out of character for him to be not scared anymore.
Yeah.
It's a tricky situation where it's like make a roll, but don't make a roll. Just make judgment calls on it.
I'd say that it's more for when you introduce a new threat, a new source of fear. So when it's a good point to transition. Like you don't have to do it, but if you're transitioning from nothing happening, it's a sunny day, to suddenly there's something in the back of the mind, or the hairs raised on the back of the character's neck.
That's true, but you can also do that sort of stuff, those transitions with pure narrative effects.
Absolutely.
Like when we're during this particular session, the characters were transferring from one ship to the other. Everything was going well. It was a simple transfer, and all I did was say the lights flicker in the when they get to the new ship, all the lights blink out for a few moments, and the players and the characters were generally suddenly disturbed as to what was going on. And no fear check was required. But there's a narrative hook there, which almost did the same thing as a fear check.
Yeah. But it's for if you need it.
Exactly.
These are tools that you can use to reinforce that.
Just to reiterate something that you said there, Mike, as well, the one thing that I think you can use, because this game provides you with the strain threshold, which is a fantastic way, which we don't see in other games, that's sort of not just your physical exhaustion sort of value, for want of a better term, it's also your psychological. Because when you're looking at social encounters, that's the thing that's being attacked, is your strain threshold. So the same sort of thing can apply in a horror setting. And like environmental factors which are affecting wounds, such as, lava and heat and whatever else, that there's nothing wrong, I don't think, with saying, depending on how they're role-playing, in a scenario like that, where, like what you mentioned, Mike, before, where there is that flickering of light, and if you're seeing that reaction from characters, you might be saying, and I'm not saying doing this for every single encounter because it may not necessarily be appropriate, but you can certainly say, okay, everybody have a point of strain, because it's that next level again of adding to that, and it bypasses soak and whatever else. And I think the players are going to be more inclined to go, oh, this is serious. We're actually taking some sort of psychological stress from the scenario.
Which is funny you should mention that, because in this particular scenario, the end creature that was haunting them essentially was a despair creature. Like, it attacked them on a mental level.
Yeah.
And by the end, it was just dealing them raw strain damage.
Yeah.
And one, I think all the players ended up essentially passing, out from that, or being, which in this case, they weren't passing out. They were being subdued by the horror.
Yep.
They were taken by this despair creature. They'd given in totally. Except for one character, which happened to be the Jawa, who managed to save the day by upgrading a check, upgrading the incoming check that this creature threw at him. It rolled a despair, giving him time to rip out his blowtorch and cut this thing in half, essentially.
Wow.
So the Jawa saved the day, purely because he, at one point, managed to not take as much strain damage as the rest of the party, and he saved the day. But it's interesting because everyone in the party was at this point where they were at the point of no return.
Yep.
They needed one player or one character to not be that, and it brought it back.
Yeah.
But he used the character strength to keep his character sane.
Right.
And his strength was family. And his bond to the players kept him sane enough to break through. He saw the falsity of the moment, realized everything was going wrong, and that kept him above board and kept him sane whilst everyone else gave in. Again, that was purely down from role-playing.
Yep.
The character using his motivations really, really, really well, and it worked perfectly.
That's brilliant. Yeah.
I just want to flip this on its head for a moment.
Sure.
Whoa.
Go.
So the fear rules, as you say, you can take them or leave them when you're trying to generate a feeling of fear or horror in a game that you're playing with. But where I think that they really shine is where maybe the characters are the things that go bump in the night. And they create fear. They cause the horror to everything else. Because you as a storyteller need to keep track of, X number of creatures. How do you tell who's been affected by what? And sometimes it happens more in Star Wars where you've got the fearsome rating. But similar things can be in GeneSys, and your players can be a source of fear.
Spoken like a true Vampire the Masquerade player, is that right?
Absolutely.
But I think the other thing as a final point with regards to difficulties and things like that, a couple of episodes ago we talked about disposition. The same sort of thing can apply here. That, I mean, there is a reason why they've included despairs in the outcomes, is that there's nothing wrong with an automatic upgrade without having to spend a story point to make that, because it is so much more horrible.
There's real consequence to failure here.
Absolutely.
Well, you can look at people's motivations for that. For example, if there's a scary situation and that aligns to one of your character's fears or something that goes against their motivations, you go, well, that's against that motivation of yours. That's your direct fear. You can upgrade that check twice.
I think that's quite appropriate.
Absolutely.
So
Very good.
loads of ways you can do it.
And I think as well, when you're talking about using character fears and motivations, is that you can still have a check. And whilst you can still do it narratively, having a check actually can result in maybe a character rolling a triumph or maybe succeeding beyond even what they thought they'd be able to do, which could be a really cool narrative moment of that character's growth in terms of fighting their fears and combating their fears through that check, which you could still fail it and go even worse. But, succeeding and having that cool moment as well can still work out really well with those fear checks.
Well, could you imagine failing a fear check with a despair on your direct fear?
I certainly can, because we can talk about sanity in a moment. Because that sounds
Flee and terror is
really. That's where we get into a lot of fun for the long term.
Yeah, absolutely. Which actually that kind of is a nice segue, I think.
Yes.
To talk about the sanity of what can happen to a character should they roll despairs, or should they suddenly, reach sort of that threshold of their own their own sanity, I guess. So let's talk about sanity rules, which are also part of their horror tone. Kaitlin, would you like to take us through that?
Absolutely. So when we're talking about sanity, it's and as we mentioned before, like getting a despair or even 5 failures is enough to actually create to kick in those sanity rules. And it's basically looking at when you've been scared so much to the point that now you're actually looking at some permanent traumas to your mental capacity or to your character. And one of the things I like to look at these is to consider them almost as if critical injuries, but to your mental state. I think that's the easiest way to look at it, particularly when we're talking about sanity and fear, because some of these things, they're longer term, and the only way to get rid of some of these mental traumas is actually to roll triumphs, or in some cases seek, intense meditation, therapy, medication, or similar means as it's written in the book, which I think is pretty interesting. Maybe having your character go away for a little while they get therapy for their mental trauma is a little too close to home in some role-playing aspects. But it still has some really cool things, and they do have a table here that actually gives you some examples, and I'll share some of them with you as well. So when we're looking at severity, and again, it is rated on severity similar to our critical injury charts, but you can have obsession where you could spend a despair or failure, and you can represent their obsession affecting their ability to interact with others. So one of the things I could possibly use as an example of that is the Evil Dead remake that was recently done, where she is obsessed with whatever is inside the forest, and she is trying to talk to her friends about how terrifying this is. And like, she clearly has got some mental trauma after what happened to her when she went outside the house. If anyone's seen the movie, you'll know what I'm talking about. But because she was so obsessed and so scattered about what she saw in the forest, she's losing it. And everyone she tries to talk to doesn't make any sense to them, because she is talking like a crazy person, rambling, because she is so terrified of what just happened. So they get setbacks to all character social skill checks for the remainder of that encounter. And
that situation of her no one believing her and being obsessed with it, that is like an internal horror almost, because she knows what she's seen. She knows it's real. The fact that none of her friends believe it or take her warnings, that is horror in itself.
That's good.
Yeah.
It's a horror layered on top of the horror. That's almost like a terror caused by the horror.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, in saying that as well, say, for example, you fail your fear check. And so you get into the era of you get into the sanity rules, and you want to see what kind of mental trauma they're going to get because of that despair. Well, then if you roll another despair, or you get enough failures within your sanity check, that's when you actually start layering on some of the severities of these, which I think is actually really cool as well. So as you said before, adding terror on top of terror, even if it's a relatively easy severity, it can still go up and get laid on even more and more and more to the point where you're rolling 2 setbacks, 3 setbacks to your social checks with people, which I think just adds to just how terrified you are and how unable to communicate the fear that you have inside yourself and that terror that's being laid on top of you. The next one that we have is the average, which is phobia. The character gains a new fear relating to the circumstances that led to the fear check. So it's important to remember, like a critical, these stick with the character. They stay with them until they either roll a triumph on their next fear check relating to that, or they get therapy, or they get heavily medicated.
They're arguably harder to remove than crits too.
Yeah.
So a phobia, that's pretty self-explanatory. So say a character gets bitten by a spider, they happen to then be afraid of spiders, and now they have a phobia of spiders, which is more than just being afraid in that circumstance. It is a constant thing that carries with that character everywhere they go. If they even, as perhaps in the circumstance that Martin said before, it's just perhaps a slight sound on the side of the wall of a scratching noise. To that character that has a spider phobia, as soon as they hear that noise might be nothing, but they have a phobia of spiders, and they think inside their head that it's spiders crawling along the walls, and they lose their mind, right? It's a good way of adding that layered aspects to horror in this setting.
Right, I'm out.
Just quietly, people with spider phobias are the best. They're so easy to scare. It's great. No. It's like
you just add an extra leg to anything, and it's the worst thing imaginable.
Well,
it's like wrong.
It's like if there's a spider in my house, you say, "Well, they always come in threes," and Or never sleep with your mouth open because spiders are attracted to the vibration of people snoring. So that's why it's a fact that people will swallow about 60 spiders in their lifetime.
It's accurate.
By the way, everyone should know GM Hooly is afraid of spiders.
God.
I didn't have the heart to tell you when I actually came to the house. There was a giant huntsman in the hallway. He ran behind the cupboard where he keeps his keys.
Look, there's only one good spider, and that's a dead one.
Oh.
Yeah, I do not like them at all.
So moving on before we get any more complaints from our listeners who actually do have a spider phobia.
GM Kaitlin, I'd like to pause there for one moment because I have one more interesting spider fact.
Oh, there we go.
Oh, okay.
They don't sleep.
And they never forget. They're like elephants in that way.
I once stood on a spider by accident in the garage at home, right? It's a giant huntsman. And if you're familiar with Australian huntsmans, they're quite large.
They are.
It felt like a grape popping under my foot.
I swear, but in also saying that if anyone knows GM Huzz, you're also a very tall man. So if you say the spider is large, it's probably larger than even an averagely large spider.
Proportionally in size, correct.
That's right.
And literally, I'm not even joking, 2 nights later I went back to the garage and I swear this thing's a mate. Came back to the crime scene. I turned the light on. Yes. I turned this because this is when I was living on acreage. So the garage is like away from the house. It's a steel building.
Yeah.
Right. So I turn the light on. Imagine going across in the dark. Ian's fear right here. This is great. Turn the light on in the garage. Look down. I make eye contact with this thing. This other huntsman is back.
Eyes contact.
Yeah, he had 8 eyes. I had 2, so I immediately felt outnumbered. And this thing ran at me. They do.
Yeah,
but this thing
You killed his father.
Yeah, it was full of hate because I killed its friend. And
I'm an ego spidoya. You killed my father.
That's correct. I'm not. He had 8 reasons. He really hated me.
He really had an 8 problem.
He did. Long story short, I'm not overly scared of spiders, but I have a general rule of thumb. I leave them alone. I leave them alone. They leave me alone. Simple as that. This thing ran at me, and I was like, "No, I'm out." I jumped and ran away from the thing, and it leapt off the concrete step into the grass.
They do.
I'm like, I've never seen a huntsman this aggressive.
They're leapers.
I know. They will literally jump off the wall when you're walking
Wow,
past.
he really aided you.
They don't sleep.
I think our new logo should be a spider with D20 in every hand, on every leg, and that can be our new new Dice Pool podcast logo.
So
Huntsman, Australian Huntsman.
This 3-host podcast as I run from the room.
The spider flavor.
So my hands are actually sweating. Anyway,
Sorry.
I hate spiders. I really do. How do I survive in this country? Because I stay the hell away from them.
Sorry for that interruption, Kaitlin. Please proceed.
No, I think that was accurate and a very good description of what life is like in Australia, and I even still miss it. So the next one is our hard severity, and that is delusion, which can make for some really fun role play if you have some really good role players around, which is basically, as it sounds, you can spend your failure and despair for the character to generate and represent their delusion affecting their ability to interact with others, adding setback to a character's perception and all willpower based checks for the remainder of the encounter. So I would imagine, continuing on with the theme of spiders, why not, considering I know it's making GM Hooly uncomfortable, which is always fun. But imagine if you had that character who has a phobia of spiders and it gets layered on, and then all of a sudden they start to be able to see spiders. But none of the other characters can see them. But they certainly can. They're there in the room. They know they're there. So interacting and being able to make those willpower saves or even be able to do perception because all they see is spiders in the room can make for some really interesting role-playing situations, particularly if that character is not able to get rid of that delusion. Yeah. Or maybe even if you have a character who had a dead person, a person who died in their past. And yet every time they turn around, that character is there, dead. Talking to them. No one else can hear them.
Or they blind themselves and they still see the person. That's all they can see.
Yeah. And I don't know if anyone's watched the new series of the Haunted House, The Haunting of Hill House.
That's one.
That's a new Netflix series. I have finished that and it is amazing. But it makes a really cool moment where a horrible trauma has occurred to the father where he still sees the wife and still talks to the wife. all the time in front of the other characters that are in the show. He still talks to her. Really good example. No one else can see her, and he talks about how, losing a spouse. By the way, none of this is spoilers. You all know this happens in the first episode. But he talks about how grieving widows will still talk to their spouses even after they've passed away as a coping mechanism. So everyone just kind of deals with that, but it's still a deep-rooted trauma that is staying with him even past the encounter.
But how about this as well? Like, if someone's got a delusion and they're watching for the party because they can't sleep in the haunted house, and he's keeping an eye out to see if anything creeps up on them, and he succeeds on his perception check, he's definitely seen something. But when he turns to tell the party, because he's rolled a couple of threat, it's spiders, man. They're everywhere. And no one believes him that he's just seen something.
Yeah.
But it's an actual legit spider, and no one's...
That could happen. That would be great. I love it.
Yeah.
Well, that actually would be interesting in playing with characters who have a delusion on what's real and what's not real. But that's probably going a little too in depth into the actual setting, which I do tend to love my horror settings. So, so the next one is neuroses. So so this is the daunting one. Whenever the character gains strain for any reason, voluntary or involuntary, they gain 1 additional strain. So that's kind of playing on the fact of just how, sanity can play its part in making a character feel fatigue or feel constantly exhausted or just slowly going into complete and utter insanity.
And that is a huge, the mechanical setback to that is insane. If you're a spellcaster doing that.
What a great choice of words.
I know, right? I totally meant that.
But could you imagine being involved in a social encounter with a neurosis? Everyone could play off of it.
I know, right?
Oh my gosh. Yeah. Imagine if you had 4 people or 5 people in a room that each had one of these traumas and they're all trying to interact with each other. There's your horror setting right there.
Yeah. Well, as a former police officer, I can tell you that is an experience like no other. When you have to talk to people who've got, we talk about delusions as well, just going back one, where people believe that they're someone else. It's not just a physical, like they're not seeing something physical. They're actually believing their own delusion that they are someone.
Well, paranoia is delusion.
Oh, exactly.
Paranoia is probably the most common.
Yeah. But dealing with that is really, really difficult, especially when you're trying to communicate something to someone. So if you can imagine a scene from like a horror RPG like Cthulhu, where you're a doctor and you're in a mental institution and you're trying to tell all of these insane patients that this horror is coming down the hallway and they have to escape. The social aspect for that is quite interesting and how that would actually play out, because you're talking about the reverse, I guess, of trying to deal with people who have that rather than you as a character having that sort of delusion or that neurosis. Dealing with other characters with that sort of neurosis. That's, that's another level again.
I just like that word.
Neurosis. It is kind of a cool word.
It's got a ring to it.
Right.
And the last but not least is formidable. And this is a broken mind. And this is when the character's strain threshold is halved, rounding up after you've halved it, of course. So that really goes into the fact of they've gotten so scared to the point that they've lost their mind. They probably belong in the mental institution that Ian was talking about in his previous example. They could have a combination of one of these. They could have more than one of these. They could have multiple ones. They could even start the game technically role-playing out with having one of these just to make role-playing a little bit more interesting in a horror setting. And also, I know we say this every single time we read out rules from the book, these are just guidelines. You don't have to roll the dice and go, here's the severity of what you got. Oh, this is going to be delusion for you. You can role play whatever seems reasonable within the check that you've just done.
Yep.
You could even create your own ones completely.
Absolutely.
I mean, we could even get Michael back in again and he could bring us some psychological ones that we probably aren't even aware of unless we have the DSM in front of us.
Well, I was about to say, apparently there's a few books written on psychology. So you could...
Exactly.
Really?
We just get the DSM and you just roll. You have to roll a D100, a D100, and then whatever page it is, that's the condition that you have.
That'd be amazing.
That'd be pretty interesting.
Well, I don't know where...
It's just one of those ones that you could use them as a check. You could have fails, or you could just use them as really interesting role-playing points. You don't have to have everything as prescribed as it is in the book. Have fun with it. Make sure it fits your characters. Make sure what's happening in the scene, and also make sure it's playable in the future. Like sometimes having a character that, if you want to have a character that's going to be delusional to the point where he thinks everyone is trying to kill him, but he's an integral PC, it can make that really difficult to continue on.
I can't remember where I saw it. Somebody decided to do a critical hit table. I think you mentioned this earlier, Kat. They did a critical hit table specifically for psychological traumas. So instead of like when you're attacking somebody with strain, that from a psychological perspective, that if they take a crit, so in other words, if you are rolling a triumph, that it will have a psychological effect, which, could be interesting. I don't know whether I subscribe to it, but, there are people who have taken that next level approach to go, right, well, this is obviously an integral part in my game. So, let's look into that as well.
I mean, I'd probably just expand the trauma and their effects chart here a bit and run that.
Yeah, exactly.
I think as well, one thing to add when it comes to looking at these fear and trauma and sanity checks is that there's certain abilities that you can actually create and have in your setting that allows your character to really shine in these types of fear and check. Like we talk about these when it comes to settings, boosts and setbacks. For example, in the Dark Heresy game that we're playing with Michael, my character has an above normal tolerance towards fear and things that other people would actually find gut-wrenching, wouldn't be able to process because of the history that my character has had. My character was previously possessed, and I actually have death sight, which means everywhere I look, I just see people being killed all the time and constantly being murdered in front of me in all these horrible different ways. So for me to do a fear check is different from another character, and having those talents that characters can actually purchase with their XP and be able to use in those checks can be really powerful and really important to recognize when characters do take those talents. So, and actually be able to, if they do purchase it, allow them to use it.
Yeah.
Indeed.
Find ways to include it.
Cool. All right, so that's basically the rules. It gives us a bit of an idea as to how we can apply a horror tone to our games. And hopefully we've given people a few ideas in regards to just the rules themselves, so the mechanics behind it, and how you can apply that in a horror setting.
Before you carry on,
yes,
one more piece of advice.
Yes.
If you're interested in running a horror game and are already in a pre-existing game, there's no reason, speaking this is a GM perspective, there's no reason why you can't just switch up your non-horror game into a horror game for 1 or 2 or 3 adventures. Well,
absolutely.
Yeah.
And that'll give you a feel for it and how the players adapt to it and how you can implement that into GeneSys. So you don't have to focus fire on a horror setting, an entire new campaign. It can sometimes be good to short and sweet for horror. So that's not a bad way of looking at it as well.
Good point. Very good point. Nice way to...
We've even done that in one of the settings with you, Ian, and it was because of one particular item was causing horror and terror to happen that we all had to do fear checks because it was bringing things back to life. From you were seeing dead comrades and things like that being brought back to life, and that was just one session, and that was even in Star Wars.
Yep, that is true. So it can be done in anything. So look for the Night's Edge horror setting coming. Anyway. So that's those really good points to end off on. So now that we've got the core basis of what we can do from a mechanical perspective, and also how we can link all of that in. So tonight, what we're going to do as part of the episode, we're going to take you through a fairly simple setting roulette with horror as our overall tone. So if you, the listener, cast your mind back a few episodes to our first setting roulette, we had a lot of fun, and we've had a lot of requests to have another setting roulette on the show. We generated our Night's Edge setting, which you can listen to, which we did 6 live play episodes about. And that was, quite successful and a lot of fun to do. So, Kaitlin, can you give us a bit of a quick rundown on what a setting roulette is for those who may be listening, to the show, but for the first time.
Absolutely. So a setting roulette is effectively where everyone around the table provides 3 ideas. They could be ideas about characters. They could be ideas generally about the setting. They could even be weapons, items, just 3 completely random things. And particularly because we know that we want to create a horror setting for this purpose, we're going to be looking at things that potentially could be horrifying. Doesn't have to be. We could make it that way. You never know. But we basically write down 3 random things and we put them in a hat to draw out of effectively. So each person around the table has one of their 3 things selected, and from those things that are selected, we create a story, a world, characters, anything that actually fills in the picture of what a setting would be with those items.
Sounds good. Now, obviously, everybody's going to be aware that one person at the table is in a different country. So how are we going to do this? We're going to get the person who's going to choose theirs, and obviously, Kaitlin, when you choose whoever it is that you've got to choose from, we'll be just rolling a dice, old school. In a
now
D6.
that's very weird for this type of podcast. Why would we roll dice to make a decision?
I know, right?
Seems very strange, doesn't it?
Well, a single dice anyway. So yeah. So
that's right. It's not really a dice pool if there's only one.
So, Mike, would you like to choose Caitlin's?
Sure. What sort of D6 do you want me to roll, Kaitlin?
A pretty one.
Okay. It's
black and red. Do you have a black and red die?
It's
That's
red.
My
It's red and yellow. It's speckled with black.
Like Hungry Jacks.
It is actually a very Hungry Jacks dice. If Hungry Jacks were to produce a dice, this would be the dice. Are you satisfied
Okay,
with
no
dice?
purple.
I'm sorry.
No.
Let's roll
All right, okay,
Here it
let's
comes.
just roll it.
So,
We're hungry for horror.
in usual Mick fashion, I rolled a 1. However, I think it's going to make Kaitlin happy because that is necromorphs.
Oh, actually, it does make me happy, but I did have another one that I thought would have been pretty cool for a horror setting, but all right.
Then you should put it. You
Necromorph
should put it as number 1. Then I was guaranteed.
I
to
should
roll it.
have. Rookie error.
What we might actually do is put up all of our 3 choices up online on Facebook, and everybody can make a comment about it later on. But
Generate.
so yeah.
How about you could generate your own setting using our...
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. So I'll keep a list of the settings as they come up. So first up, well, settings, the setting concepts. The first one we have is necromorphs, which is going to be.
yeah.
There's nothing scary about necromorphs, though. I don't get it. They're just body horror flesh creations.
They're just people, a bunch of people, all in the one body, trying to live their life.
Yeah, you know what? They are being discriminated against.
Wow.
They are.
Necromorphists.
Is that a word?
Necromorphisms.
It is now.
It is.
All right. So, Mun, would you like to choose Mike's?
Choose wisely.
Really? Paddle steamers.
Ooh, okay. So immediately we have like a Old West sort of feel to it.
Okay.
Oh, I wonder why.
Yeah, Red Dead.
I wonder who's been playing Red Dead? Yes,
Well, actually,
I
no,
agree.
that's not from Red Dead at all.
Oh.
That's from another source of inspiration.
I know I know where it's from because I've been reading that book.
There you go.
There you go.
All right. So,
Mun.
yep. Did you want to pick mine?
Yes, I do. So reach over the table.
We've all fallen for that trap.
Yes, I'm going to choose that one. So this one from Martin says sleep paralysis.
Ooh.
Interesting. All right.
So for mine,
And who's picking yours again?
that would be Mike is picking mine.
I have chosen it. I'm
And?
unfolding the paper.
Because I've been very secretive for whatever reason.
A mystery detective.
A mystery detective.
Is
see?
the
There's some
detective
sort of
a-
mystery on the water, see?
Is the detective a mystery, or is the detecting mystery?
Okay. So we have necromorphs, paddle steamers, sleep paralysis, and mystery detective.
Why do you laugh at my mystery detective?
It's I just can't work out.
Because he himself is the mystery.
Is he the mystery, or is he looking for mysteries?
I don't know. I would.
I like this. Let's go with it. He's the mystery.
There you
We're being
go.
haunted again by that damn detective. Okay, well,
So let's start putting our collective brains together then and come up with a bit of a setting roulette. So obviously it's a horror setting. So we've established that right from the start. And that's kind of given us a bit of an idea of what we're going to choose anyway.
it's given us a good filter.
It has.
Well, I think if we look at a baseline of where this is going to be set, it's at a location where paddle steamers are prevalent.
Right.
Would I be mistaken on that?
So
What
I'm
if it's a
thinking...
specific paddle steamer?
Well, I'm imagining like an old west sort of up the Mississippi type paddle steamer.
Yep, that works.
Shipping coal and wood and whatever supplies up and down the river.
I was thinking Huckleberry Finn type sort of.
that's
what
design
about-
as well.
I don't think Huckleberry Finn had a paddle steamer.
No, he was.
I thought he just had a couple of planks of wood and was going down the river that way, saying some very inappropriate things in today's day and age.
So I have an idea to combine things.
Okay, go.
To start us off, if you want to kick us off. So yes, so there's a river like the Mississippi where they transport coal up and down the river. Yep.
To the various towns along the way.
But somewhere along this route, something ancient has been disturbed. Maybe there's someone, a mysterious detective, who stumbled across the wrong thing, and he's being the one that's released this evil upon everyone. And he's gone insane and has started stitching people together into these creatures that are then inhabited by this evil spirit or power, which, when it finds people, like in the nearest source is these paddle steamers that row up and down the river. They find people and they come at them when they're asleep.
Oh,
Could I build on that?
sure.
Yeah.
As we're talking about the paddle steamers going up and down the river doing coal, rather than them actually having a pretty normal, like the paddle steamer that we're talking about where it's going to be set on, it could perhaps be the paddle steamer that carries bodies of travelers who died in other cities along the Mississippi. It carries the bodies up and down the river itself, kind of like a traveling mortuary or a traveling what's the guy that drives the dead bodies around? I can't remember his name.
Dead Man Driver.
Dead Man Driver? It's very mysterious. But
Nobody
perhaps
knows what
as
he
well,
does.
perhaps there is someone that is piecing them together or doing something wildly inappropriate with these bodies and summoning this evil, and this is the perfect place for him to use it because there's just a non-stop supply of these bodies being thrown onto the paddle steamer to take them anywhere but the town that it's in, until one day one particular person who a detective was looking for happened to die, and he had to follow the body and then found even worse things happening on that paddle steamer and has to try and figure it out. And only to find out that every single time someone is, because they'll also do they'll also transport people on the top with the dead bodies underneath, and it keeps going after people like that.
I just want to get this idea out there because I like to think that their attack pattern is that they find people asleep, but when they attack them, when they crawl into the room above them and hang on the roof or whatever, the person wakes up. And so they're completely conscious as this thing comes down at them, but they can't move, they can't cry out, they can't do anything. Well,
kind of like some kind of telepathic abilities that blocks that they can take control of their mind and not make and so that they can't move and they can see and feel everything, but they can't actually physically move their muscles.
Well, how about this? Maybe building upon that similar concept, there isn't a paddle steamer that's carrying the dead. Instead, there's a bit of a local mystery of this foggy patch of the river. This one paddle steamer every so often comes steaming out of the mist, and it is just decorated with these dead necromorph people. And this mystery paddle steamer comes up alongside other paddle steamers, and as it draws near, everyone on the other paddle steamer, or the living people on the one that happens to be passing by, are afflicted by sleep paralysis. And they can do nothing as the other paddle steamer rams them and all the necromorphs climb aboard and then start taking them across to be fed into whatever is making these necromorphs.
Oh, can I take that another
That
level?
is cool.
What about that? To be able to power the paddle steamer in the first place, that it doesn't use coal or wood or whatever else.
Uses souls.
It uses people. So they have to drag these people from these other paddle steamers and then throw them into the furnace, which keeps on billowing this mist. So we've got the origin of where the mist is coming from.
Well, maybe instead of burning the people, there's this ritual or something that occurs on that paddle steamer that extracts the soul. And the soul's what burns, and that's why they have these flesh carcasses that they use to make the necromorphs.
Oh, so that the souls are gone. But
Souls are gone, so all that's left is these empty shells,
which get filled with something else.
get filled with something else.
Wow.
This paddle steamer isn't maybe of this earth. Maybe it is indeed actually a ghost ship straight from the pits of hell, and it comes to Earth via a bank of
Sticks.
no,
sticks
what's
kind
the
of thing?
what's I'm pause it for a second. What's the plants that grow in the riverbanks in Australia?
mangroves.
Mangroves. So this paddle
fucking
steamer.
hate mangroves.
There's a big it's along this particular stretch of the river. There's like a massive infestation of mangroves, which mosquito infested swamp trees.
Think bayous.
Exactly. And this particular thicket of mangroves peels open, sort of like the tree from Sleepy Hollow, and this paddle steamer comes steaming out of that thicket of mangroves, billowing a cloud of like screaming souls as its boilers.
Because I was
churn
thinking
the wheels.
of like an estuary that is coming off that people have forgotten about, that isn't on any maps or whatever else, but it actually links directly to the river Styx
No, it's on some maps.
on some maps.
Yeah.
And the mystery detective
old
happens
ones.
to be looking for those maps.
Well, and I think I really like the idea that this mystery detective is the thing that kicked off this whole adventure.
Right.
Maybe he was a paranormal investigator rather than a specific detective, and he's been tracking down this thing, or if he was a detective, he was looking for someone that went missing, and it's led him to this. But he's opened the door, not understanding what he's done, and unleashed this horror.
I'll add to that.
And so he's the guy that contracts the PCs to hunt it,
Well, maybe
to fix his error.
this might be far fetched, but maybe this mysterious detective is dead, and his soul.
No, this is great. He was one of the first ones taken.
Well, possibly, but his soul is he's basically connected to this river. He can't leave it until his task here is done, and that's to free what he did initially to create.
Yeah,
this,
maybe
this
that
monster.
happened like 100 years ago.
Exactly, but the players are also dead.
Yeah.
But they don't know, of course.
Maybe they do know, but they're very much attached. Their task is to bring this paddle steamer down or solve the mystery of it, because the more that it terrorizes and consumes, the more they are attached to this river, and that will start to deteriorate their sanity. Because these players, these characters, could have been doing this for the last 3 or 4 decades, and the task of this paddle steamer is driving them insane because they can't. They're not dead, and they're not living. They're not free to pass on to another world.
Maybe eventually, when their minds go, they become the things that inhabit the bodies.
Well, that's it.
Yeah, they've only got a short amount of time to actually to do something about it. Because you could play it in two different ways. Like potentially, you could have, as we were talking about, the PCs be the ghost of the ship, and they have to try and overturn it from the inside. In terms of they would just recently, you could start off the campaign with them on a ship that gets taken over by the necromorphs and all the creatures that are on there, and so they have to try and fight their way to actually redeem whatever soul they have left, so it doesn't get taken away on the paddle steamer into the fiery pits of hell or whichever hellscape was created with
burnt
that.
up to powers.
But, yeah. Another option is that they are living, and the paddle steamer that in the opening scene that got taken out by the ghost paddle steamer, they had family members that were on board and they were waiting for them, and they never showed up, and they have to try and track it down, and they're guided by the mysterious detective,
Who himself
the
is
ghost
dead.
of, in order to track down the different clues in order to find out who they need to go after.
And to correct his mistake.
I imagine this detective has been around since like the penal colonies of America, sort of thing. He's the ghost that's been around that long, or he was very old when he died, sort of thing. But going back to what Kaitlin just said and whatever's been said just now, going back to sleep paralysis, which feels somewhat untouched at this moment, maybe all the characters, if they're living characters, depending on how you want to play this particular adventure, if they're living, maybe each character is haunted by the deaths of a family member from this necromorph paddle steamer, because their family members are on the ship in sleep paralysis, so they're all wide awake when their souls were fed into the steamer's boiler. So everyone who's
because
attached
they've
to
been
this
paralyzed
adventure,
by these creatures.
exactly.
Yeah.
Everyone who's attached to this adventure through bloodlines and etc. are haunted by these nightmares of being fed into an iron boiler, or their souls being fed into an iron boiler.
Well,
I do also like the idea that part of their tactics when they take over a ship is because they've been around for a while. They know how to do this. They don't want, it's a no mess, no fuss thing. And naturally also creating the people who they're about to take over the ship also get sleep paralysis, because there's nothing more terrifying than being able to see, hear and feel everything, but still not being able to move and being slowly dragged away by these creatures overboard into a ship, and there's nothing you can do about it. Like, as a terrifying thing, I love that aspect of it.
I like the idea that, they can't put you into, they can't paralyze you unless you're already asleep, right? So they have to crawl into your mind and get you. And so if the players mess up or they sleep at the wrong time, half the party might get paralyzed with this one person trying to fend off necromorphs to save his friends. So the whole party tries not to sleep, and that adds penalties as they go through.
Yeah, absolutely.
You can make checks like resilience checks to try and stay awake. Or vigilance or checks, or whatever check, discipline. However you want to implement it mechanically.
Yep.
That's very cool. I like that. Sorry, Kaitlin?
And particularly if we're talking about paddle steamers, cocaine is very prevalent in those times. So there's a good way of staying awake.
And adding narcotics to that setting adds another element.
Well, you look at like
addictions and
addictions
stuff like that.
And what it does to the mind.
In terms of delusions.
Yes.
So you could by avoiding the horror and the fear by taking copious amounts of drugs, you self-induce it later on down the track.
Exactly. You're walking a fine line of, the fear, the horror that these creatures create to what you do to yourself.
I saw this awesome mental image of like this like steamer moving down the river, and this mist rolls in, and there's this ominous sensation falls over everything. The sound of the water, the sound of the world beyond the steamer stops.
Muffled.
It ceases. All you can hear is the splash of the steamer's paddles hitting the water. Then you hear in the distance this like distant creak of another steamer coming through the mist. And you can see the outline through the mist, this black silhouette of this other steamer slowly moving up alongside the living's steamer. And then out of the mist it emerges, and there's this like old, decaying, rusting steamer with wooden planks falling off here and there. It shouldn't be seaworthy, but it's still floating. Its paddles are like falling apart, so it's actually just doing nothing to the water, but it's still working, and there's necromorphs crawling all over it.
And I can imagine that the people
like spiders.
I'm
out.
I can imagine the people that were on watch at this time because there's a night shift.
I'm picturing this in the day to make it even more terrifying.
Yeah, but there's always there's always a crew that is asleep.
Oh yes,
because they take turns. But whoever was up on board at the time, one of them knows the story. And so the mist rolls in, which isn't necessarily unusual for this area. And he starts to hear the paddle steamer, and he goes, I know what's happening. And he runs to wake up his companions because he knows that if they're caught asleep, it's over. But it's already too late.
Adding to that as well,
he can't wake them.
You know, it'd be cool. The paddle steamer has a whistle, right? That can only be heard by people they're going to hear it subconsciously
in their sleep.
No. They hear asleep and or awake, but they only ever hear it at the moment of realization of what it is. So I might see that paddle steamer and realize what it is and hear the whistle. 5 minutes later, someone else will see the paddle steamer and realize what it is and hear this shrill, haunting whistle. So it's a subconscious whistle that plays in people's minds at the moment that they realize that doom's upon them.
But it'd be terrifying from the perspective of the person trying to wake your friend. They've got their eyes wide open. You know that they can see you, but they're not moving.
No. There's a blackness like crawling, a rotting decay crawling in the whites of their eyes.
Oh,
Like a swimming in the whites.
yeah.
Well, I'm successfully
cool.
creeped out so far.
Well, let's see. These are necromorphs, right? Which are supernatural in how we've sort of been spitballing this.
I imagine that they're stitched together.
Yeah,
Some
by
might have
whatever
3
means.
arms. Yeah.
Exactly. But you think people might throw themselves overboard the steamer to get away from them. But little do they know, there's the whole riverbed.
It's just
beneath
filled
it's
with
filled with
necromorphs and stuff
They
like that.
swim
yeah.
down to the bottom, thinking that instead of riverbed mud, there's just the entire
Arms,
riverbed is just
yeah.
clawing arms, which drag you down into the mud.
I love that.
There is
That
no
so cool.
safety
There's no
once
safety.
the mist rolls in.
Yeah. Like the mist itself brings in a supernatural pocket of reality, or more or less.
Essentially.
There's no getting away from it. Once you're in there, chances are, until that other steamer gets its fill, you're stuck in the mist.
Interesting stuff.
I think we've got our setting. I think we've got our setting.
I have the
That's
name
it.
for it too.
Yeah.
The Styx steamer.
Oh.
Steamer of the Sticks?
Yeah.
Stick steamer?
Styx steamer.
Not too sure I'm sold on the whole steamer bit, but sure. I think that's...
You never are, Ian. I've always said that.
No, I think...
Not sure if I'm 100% sold on the steamer bit.
Yeah, the
bit wrong.
Styx steamer.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I actually agree that sounds like a weird sex thing.
It does actually.
Okay, but anyway, we have our setting.
Which is probably equally as terrifying as what we've just created.
Maybe. But yeah, lots and lots of little bits that you can draw on there for to enhance the horror of the setting that you're in. And it can start so quite mundane and then can basically you get dragged into this mystery that, will probably end with you being dragged away into the abyss.
I love the quest giver being
Dead.
the dead.
Dude.
The person, he just shows up from time to time and asks people to help.
Or maybe he appears in different locations around the world.
Yeah.
Like you have some
Because he's desperately trying to fix
exactly.
what he did.
Some like specialty investigator in Germany gets this haunting visage of this detective coming into his mind, telling he has to go to America, and this guy's unnatural compulsion to go to America to this particular river and find out what's going on.
I just like the idea of it just seems like some normal guy walks in and contracts you to come
Yeah,
to this
that works too.
this place, and it's later when you delve into the mystery and you discover, wait a minute, the description of this guy that originally, and then you realize he's dead.
Yeah, because that can be sort of as far as the character generation, that is a key thing that you have to have in a similar sort of way that you've got to have your backgrounds and stuff like that, is that how were you brought to this location? And
He could visit everyone around the world.
exactly. So, he's not limited to a particular area. So you can just say, how did you meet this detective that's brought you into this? And then you, using those ideas from your players, you then can start to mold and morph that into more sort of horror-filled type scenarios.
And also by making this detective undead, it also makes you and the other steamer both supernatural things. It makes them timeless, because we are discussing this right now from a very 19th century sort of feel to it. So your characters would be from that era by default, I feel.
Yep.
However, there's nothing stopping you. This steamer could still exist today.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
And that river is still used by other ships today. So there could be an investigation still to track down that steamer in a very modern setting.
I would love to do this. You started in the 19th century, and you make your characters, and then you go and you
The
investigate this thing,
ancestors.
and they die. You just get wiped out by this thing, and then the DM says to you, roll up some new characters
50
for
years
the
later.
20th century.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. And do it sort of almost like in an It type sort of
Yeah.
level to it.
Also, sorry, Caitlin.
Oh, I was just going to say, when we talked about before, when Martin said he was going to turn it turn this setting on its head. We could also turn this setting on its head, and perhaps the PCs are actually the characters who are running and operating the ship, and you're trying to continue to meet your quota or whatever it is that's driving you to take those souls. And yet there's these pesky people that keep on trying to take you down, and you have to try and get them. You have to try and kill them and prevent them from stopping you from fulfilling your duties.
Yeah, that's cool.
Now, also, if you're listening to this and are inspired by it, you don't have to use a paddle steamer. You could make that haunted thing anything. It could be a haunted train on a train line somewhere. There's lots of
anything that can be used in the 19th century would be fantastic.
Well, you could do it on the Second World battlefield. The haunted steamer is actually a haunted German tank that rolls in with a crew of guys who want to meet their quota to fill their tanks full of to fuel the tank's diesel engine with more souls. So you could do that in any setting by just changing what the paddle steamer is.
I like the idea of a man of war.
A big battleship. That'd be fantastic too.
For a pirate setting.
Wow.
Yeah. Well, I pictured, as soon as a man of war, I pictured like a First World War dreadnought. That's what I pictured.
Yes.
I've got an idea.
Yes.
Is perhaps maybe this ship, rather than it being as we know it, it's a ship because it actually visits the world all the time, throughout all the decades, throughout all the ages, and what it does is it takes on a familiar form for that century or for that year that it's actually taking place. So it actually visits you no matter what. It visits Earth or this dimension whenever, all the time, and it just takes on a familiar form.
Yeah, that's another way of doing it as well.
And because this river where we're setting our thing has this already, this paddle steamer as being a myth, that's the form it takes.
Yeah, it plays on people's fears, essentially.
Yeah.
So it could appear anywhere in the world, or it doesn't have to be even necessarily tied to that river. It could be a horseman
absolutely.
in the middle of a desert somewhere, who rocks up with the...
And when the mist rolls in and you get transport, there's no running because there's these things running alongside you.
You can almost call it a timeless horror.
Absolutely.
Ooh.
I can just imagine the mist rolling in over a town at the middle of night.
God, there's so many crossovers from all of these different sort of horror settings. We've got a bit of a Christine thing happening with the vehicles, but we've got like a what's the Ship of the Dead type thing that's going on there as well, and then we start bringing in the mist type stuff. It's like
this would make a fantastic sci-fi setting as well.
Oh, a spaceship!
Exactly, a big haunted spaceship drops out of hyperspace or whatever your settings hyperspace equivalent is.
And all of a sudden you realize you can't wake up your sleeping crewmates.
Exactly.
Yeah. And that would be an even perfect zone for them, because if they can only sleep paralysis people who are asleep, nothing better than a ship full of people who are in cryo sleep.
And you're the crew, the skeleton crew that's been left to operate the ship.
Yep.
Well, they come in rotations. They come in off, They're very cool.
Lots of different options there. So,
now we throw the challenge out to the listeners.
Yes.
To play this and then tell us all about it.
Yeah.
Sounds like a plan. We'll put up a link on the Facebook page as well as Twitter. So, let us know what you've come up with your settings. And tell us about your stories. I think that's a great idea. Very good.
Before we wrap this up, it's fun to go through the other options.
Yes, the other options.
So my other two, other than paddle steamers, which Martin rolled his eyes at, I will add.
Really?
Was soul-consuming aliens.
Ooh.
So basically was these aliens that managed to tap in. My head canon with it was, as a starting sort of idea, was that these aliens either had a way of consuming the souls of the living by either putting up a some sort of web, I guess you could say, across the spiritual world of us. And every time a person died on Earth, instead of their souls going up to a heaven or whatever, where we might go, these aliens actually caught it in their net and used it for their own ill-gotten means. And my last one was a humanity-threatening plague.
Oh,
interesting.
So that could have been, I imagine that as sort of like an interesting backdrop. So you could have lots of other things going on in the middle of this humanity-threatening plague.
like a Walking Dead type sort of scenario?
No, I
as
imagine
well?
it's like a plague. People just dying of sickness.
Oh wow!
But
Okay.
there's other
'Cause
things.
that's terrifying.
That is terrifying. It's most horror. There's nothing you can do to stop that, especially
Yeah,
back in
and-
the Black Plague days.
Yeah. Ooh. Yeah. I had abduction. So
Ooh.
stole
mysterious
my idea.
abductions happening. Yeah, very similar. But I also had spider webs.
Ugh.
So just the suggestion
I'm glad
of
you didn't do
spiders.
that. I didn't.
Oh, imagine necromorphs with spider webs
Oh, yes.
on a paddle steamer.
I'm running away right now. Kaitlin, what were yours?
So I went with one that was a very very stereotypical horror one, which was just a haunted woods. And then my last one, which was probably one of my favorite ones because I think could have some really interesting moments, was body integrity identity disorder. Now, if anyone doesn't know what that is, that's with people who believe that they have limbs that shouldn't be there. So they actually crave to have like legs, feet, fingers, hands amputated because they don't feel that they should have them.
Right.
Yep.
That's a very
bizarre.
simplified version, by the way.
That'd be great if you combined it with necromorphs, because
Yes.
people are suddenly stricken by the desire to cut off their own limbs, and those limbs then become necromorphs. They
Right.
combine together.
Yeah, that's a really cool
Yeah.
concept. That they're feeding themselves to an evil entity that
Yeah.
wants their parts, and that entity is what's giving them that psychosis.
Exactly.
Right.
So yeah, I'll admit right now I don't have a great mind. it's very messed up in a lot of
But that's amazing.
That's right. Everybody can
But that's
now
why you guys are my friends.
everybody can have a different level of appreciation of all of our brains now. Now mine were fairly simple. I'm not the horror guy. That's all I can say.
It doesn't have to be scary to be horror.
Okay.
It can be mundane, like a paddle steamer.
Yep.
And the detective was great.
The detective was
Well,
great.
that's true.
Two
That's true.
perfect examples of two mundane things ordinarily,
Yep.
chucked in a horror setting,
Right.
can be amazing.
Okay. So the other two settings the setting ideas that I had was the asylum. I love the whole asylum settings. When I watched the absolute hell out of American Horror when they had it was set in the asylum. I love the whole crazy person thing. I've probably dealt with far too many of them in my previous career.
I love the asylum as a setting. It's great.
Yeah, it's very, very cool. You can do so much with it, with corruption and sort of, anyway. And the other one that I had was Carnivale. I absolutely love, again, the American Horror. That's probably the only sort of really big horror thing that I've ever watched.
We need to branch you out a little bit there, buddy. I think.
Sorry, what
we
was
need to
that?
branch you out a little tiny bit.
Clearly, it's just on my thing, but yeah. So the whole, the circus freaks and performers and things like that, the traveling circus, that sort of brings out, the whole that carnies type thing.
I just had a thought brought on by that would have been a great thing to have included, would have been masks of some type. I can imagine, flesh masks.
Could you imagine if we had the circus with the paddle steamer? I imagine a paddle steamer, which is a circus paddle steamer.
Yep.
All of its clowns look like clowns. They're like all big baggy pants and whatnot, right?
Oh, but
They peel the clothes back when they want to consume human flesh, and they're actually necromorphs underneath of it. So their bodies are this complete body horror. But their face, going by Martin's masks things, aren't masks as such, but they use face paint to cover up the hideous look of them. And in people's minds...
Cover up the stitching.
Exactly. But they're working on they emit this psychological aura. In people's minds, they just see really scary, messed up clowns, or in some cases, funny clowns. And they fail to see the true horror of these clowns because of this psychological aura they emit. But as soon as they peel back those clown clothes and those clown outfits, they are legit nightmares.
They've got like a mouth in their chest that's surrounded by fingers.
Yeah, or entire bodies. It's like, when a spider dies and all its limbs roll up?
Right.
Curl up into itself. Imagine when they peel back the robes and all these limbs unfold from their chest cavity.
Yeah.
Right. I'm not sleeping tonight now, so that's fine.
Each limb ends with like this big, gross, like dirty fingernail.
Oh, yes. I love it.
Right. Okay.
All right.
I am now suitably disturbed.
I think we've just created several settings.
I think so.
But yeah, so go ahead. Freak the hell out of me, if nothing else. But yeah, go and let us know on Facebook and Twitter what your settings look like. It'll be interesting to see, and let other people know what you're doing. So that was a really good discussion. Hopefully people have been satisfied yet again with our Setting Roulette. Not sure whether I'll be GMing that, but yeah, it should be a lot of fun. So should we get into some listener questions?
You mean behind the screen?
Yes, I do.
Don't you mean behind the screens?
Behind the screens.
Behind the screams.
Missed opportunity.
Completely. I thought we had a setting going on here.
Behind the screens. And welcome to Behind the Screams, or Screens, Screens, where we, the hosts of the show, will answer your games and rules questions regarding the GeneSys Role Playing Game. Now, this week we have a couple of questions, so Huzz, would you like to take us through the first one?
Sure. The first question comes from a username which I'm going to have trouble pronouncing, because I don't think it's actually a word. Oh, it's Kelly Co? I'm not sure. Kelly Co? Yeah, sure. We'll go with that. It's spelled Kelyco, but there's a lot of capitals in there, so who knows what's going on.
Yeah.
They ask, when a PC wants to aim at the opponent's head, the rules say regarding aim, if the character spends one maneuver aim to do this, the next combat check suffers 2 setback. If they spend 2 consecutive maneuvers aiming, the combat check suffers only 1 setback. Let's say the PC has 3 uncancelled successes. Does the character deal damage as usual, or since he targets the head and succeeds, there's extra damage like double uncancelled successes? I can't find a specific damage rule when aiming at vital targets or body locations.
Interesting question. Martin?
So basically my understanding is that it doesn't deal any extra damage.
Doesn't deal any damage, actually.
Yeah, exactly. The idea of a cold shot is to cause an effect. So basically you need to work with your storyteller to determine what that effect is going to be from what you've described.
Yep, exactly.
That's not to say a storyteller and the players at the table could house rule it. That does more damage. You know, every success roll does an extra 2 damage instead of 1 damage or something like that. However, you have to be careful, because if you do that, it means everyone's going to be one-shotting your NPCs all the time.
Well, for instance, a great example of how you could do that is, say you've got an opponent that's in heavy armor and he's got like 10 soak and no one can hurt him, but he's not wearing a helmet.
That's right.
So you cold shot for the head. A simple effect could be that you ignore the soak.
Yeah, that's it. Perfect example.
Yep.
Get creative with it too. Like if you see a guy with cybernetic eyes or a cybernetic part of the body that's enhancing them, I'm going to shoot that cybernetic part to try and disable it. Perfect example came up in our Dark Heresy game where Chase tried to shoot at a villain's cybernetic lungs, essentially. His pipes running from his chest to his throat. Unfortunately, the shot did miss. However, it was an interesting player choice to make, especially when I use those pipes purely as a narrative flair at the start of that character's description.
Yep.
Nowhere did I state in that character's stat block he had iron lungs that required him to live. However, if Chase had managed to hurt that character, then it hit those characters' iron lungs, it could have some detrimental effect, like the character suffered strain every turn because he couldn't breathe properly. It comes down to what you and your GM come up with.
Yep. Sure. I mean, from my understanding, the rules kind of are that you're disabling that particular, whether it be a limb or whatever else. So when we look at it from a vehicle perspective, that you're trying to destroy their shields or trying to, shut down their engines or something like that, disable their weapons. Same sort of thing applies here, is that, you're wanting to shoot someone's arm so they can't use their arm anymore. So if they've like 2-weapon combat, suddenly they can't use some of their abilities. And the same sort of thing would apply, obviously, to if you want to stop someone from running away, you might be doing a cold shot to hit them in the leg and making it, turning it into difficult terrain effectively for them.
Basically, you're trying to achieve something that would normally be achieved by advantages. So you're specifically calling out what you're attempting to do, and then taking a penalty to achieve that. You're probably going to roll less advantages because you've got those black dice mixed in there.
Yep.
But a success means you've done this.
It's certainly not to be a one kill shot for NPCs. Otherwise, that's going to end your story really, really quickly.
Now, it doesn't say that you don't deal any damage, but if you're doing a powerful effect like immobilizing them or ignoring their circle, don't add any extra damage or perhaps no damage at all because you're achieving a powerful thing that is narratively important.
Do you actually do damage, do you?
Doesn't say that you don't.
Okay, I thought I must misremembered it then.
I think there's more info in the old Star Wars rules, but what's come across here is it just says that as has been described in the question.
Yeah, if you cold shot someone's pistol, you're not going to do the person carrying the gun any
exactly.
damage.
You're not going to cause if you're attacking one of their items on their person, you're not going to deal any damage to the person, but you might destroy or add damage levels to whatever it is that you've hit.
Exactly, and it's important to keep in mind hitting a piece of equipment won't necessarily destroy that piece of equipment.
No,
but it might damage it.
They might damage it. There is the levels of damage. If I hit that gun with a cord shot with a Triumph, heck, I could completely, if the GM allowed it, destroy that weapon or disable it. Because not only have I hit it, I've jumped it straight to unusable. Because I've hit it in such a way where it's caused really critical damage.
Yeah,
exactly.
A couple of Triumphs and it could possibly explode, causing damage. Yeah.
Exactly. So, Martin, would you like to take us through our second question?
One more important thing. Cord shots.
Go.
Cord shots cord shots are still very, very useful when shooting, say, this is going back to the vehicle example, shooting at someone on a bike.
Yep.
If you want to target the person on the bike, the rider, that would be a cord shot.
True.
So that's when a cord shot's very, very useful. In that instance, when you hit the rider, you will deal damage just to the rider, not the bike.
Yep. And the other thing to add to that as well is that when they're behind some level of cover, so if you're trying to shoot someone through a windscreen or something like that, that you would be adding the cover bonuses as well.
Another thing as well, back to the vehicles again, a lot of similar complex mechanisms if you're trying to disable it. If a player wants to shoot the shield generator on a starship, if that player has never been on a starship before, he might not necessarily know where that shield generator is. So you could ask, as a GM, you could ask that player to make a perception check or a knowledge check to know where that item is to shoot at it. And that adds another layer of difficulty as well. If that person's not familiar with their target, where will they know to shoot at to disable the shield generator? It's not like ships have, this is the shield generator, shoot here, written on the side. That'll come down to the character's familiarity with what they're shooting at. And that's where checks you wouldn't ordinarily do in combat, like knowledge and perception, can be quite vital and really spice up the gameplay a little time.
Very good. So, Martin, would you like to take us through the next question?
Yep. So GM Mick, our friend GM Mick from the previous episode, has asked us a question. In the GeneSys Core rulebook, under environmental effects, page 111, it discusses things like vacuum and fire and acid and corrosive atmospheres. My question is this: is the damage from these sources reduced by soak? It implies so, and the damage and soak rules indicate it would. I'm curious, as a vacuum, for example, deals 3 wounds per round, which would mean a character who is soak 3 or higher, which is only brawn 3, would be unaffected by the cold vacuum of space. They would, of course, suffocate eventually, but that aside, it seems odd. Similar situations with fire, etc. I guess damage seems too low to me if soak is involved, and I can see scenarios for and against the rules as he's currently reading them. And on page 112, falling damage is clearly spelt out in relation to soak as another point.
So,
now we answered this already online.
We did.
But we will go through it again just to make sure.
It's a little known thing.
It's easily
worth going over.
Easily missed, yeah.
Absolutely.
Which is simply that it comes down to the wording. Now, whenever you're looking at rules, grammar is very important. And it words it that you take wounds.
Suffer.
You suffer wounds. in this case, as opposed to taking damage. So when you suffer 3 wounds per round, that means that that goes straight to your wound threshold.
You're bypassing soak.
Because damage is what you take before soak is applied, and then you suffer wounds.
The suffering is the byproduct of damage hitting soak. If the words do not say damage, then you, generally speaking, if it says suffer, you're hitting straight on your wounds. Or in some cases, strain threshold too.
Yep.
Well, particularly in strain threshold as well.
Strain threshold.
So yeah, that's the key thing to remember. In falling, you do take damage, so you get to apply soak, but yeah.
So suffer wounds, suffer strain, it bypasses soak.
The word is suffer.
But then if it just basically says damage, well, obviously you're applying soak.
Yeah, that's a general rule of thumb anyway.
Yep, absolutely.
To add a bit of a scary horror theme to that, you know, it'd be a great environmental effect.
What's that?
Like a necrotic disease. You suffer 1 damage every turn.
Yep.
When you hit your wound threshold, you turn undead.
Oh my God.
Ooh.
Now that'll put death clock into the situation.
That is true.
Or an undeath clock.
Oh, that's an interesting monster. An undeath clock. Interesting. That's a little bit scary. Very good.
That similar principle can be used for psychosis. If the situation you mentioned earlier, earlier in the episode, every turn, due to some sort of aura that's being emitted by some sort of evil, players could suffer 1 strain every turn.
I think
Hit it, they go insane.
I think it'd be great as well that if that brings in resilience. Yes. People could roll resilience against this rot or this contagion to delay it for it. It doesn't get rid of it. It just delays it.
Mm.
And then if you fail with despair, well, I mean, all sorts of things happen then.
You get a special treat.
We'll use treat in inverted commas. Very good.
Well, it's a treat for the GM.
That's true. That is true. Well, that was a really good discussion. Hopefully that answers the questions of both our friend GM Mick as well as, what is it?
Kellyco. Kellyco, tell us your name.
So hopefully that's answered your question. And that kind of brings us to the end of another show. If you have any questions like those that we've just answered, you can send us an email to info@thedicepoolpodcast.com or post your questions to Facebook and Twitter. There are plenty of great community members who will offer you some great advice. And we'll obviously as well, if we catch it first, we'll throw in our 2 cents as well. And hopefully you might also get your question answered on the show.
Also, don't forget, if you're on your Google machine, you can look us up at thedicepoolpodcast.com. That's where you'll find our website.
Also, make sure to like and follow us at the Dice Pool Podcast on Facebook and Twitter by searching at Dice Pool Podcast. We also have our community group that is starting to get filled with all of your activities and work, which we love to see. Please give us more.
True.
You can also find us on YouTube by searching at Dice Pool Podcast and on Discord via the D20 radio channel.
Cool. Very good. Well, that's
a body wrap.
That's a body wrap.
It's probably worth pointing out to the listeners that although this might sound like a smooth and clean episode, we had a lot of internet connection issues at the start. So there was some true horror there, I think.
Oh, I agree with that.
It sounded like GM Kaitlin was underwater.
It didn't sound like we're getting like a recorded message from hell or something. It was like a Silent Hill. It was really good. I liked it.
Very good. Now there
could have been murder. There could have been death. There could have been mayhem. Let's just put it that way.
Now there is one thing that we did forget to mention at the top of the show, which is very, very important.
Let me guess. I've got nothing.
That is the latest errata, which has been released, 1.0, which has some interesting questions that have finally been answered, especially when it comes to area effect weapons versus minions.
Hey, it took
I love that that's finally
Yes.
Yeah,
answered.
it's finally done, yes.
It took like 5 years of playtesting before they finalised it. But we got there, so it's all good.
Absolutely. I don't know, I'll be honest and say I don't know whether I necessarily agree with it, but they finally made a decision, so that's good.
But one way or another, we have an answer.
Yeah, exactly right.
Yeah.
But it also touches base with some vehicle design things, which no doubt we will be exploring in a future episode.
Yep, we'll cover
to
that.
do with vehicle combat, and we've spent a lot of time doing a lot of research, as all of my co-hosts will attest.
Kill me!
It does certainly need a little bit of work, but hopefully, if you've got any issues with vehicle combat and you're a bit adverse to it, hopefully that show will answer all of your questions. And the other thing as well that they announced was the Android adversary cards, which look really, really cool as well. So I'm looking forward to those when they... It's interesting they've announced that as well as the Android book, but it doesn't have a street date yet. So hopefully we'll be seeing something about that soon.
Does the book have a street date?
It doesn't.
Well, they might release the cards and the book together.
That would be amazing.
Nice. Yeah.
That's right.
10 out of 10 would buy if I could get them in Australia.
FFG, if you're listening. Because I've managed to get the Terran Health cards.
Yeah, and they look great.
They are fantastic. So, hopefully we'll have that in our hot little hands very, very soon. And yes, we will be doing a review episode. That's pretty much wrap, guys. I'm GM Hooly.
I am GM Huzz.
I'm GM Flano.
And I'm GM Kaitlin.
And together we are the Dice Ball Podcast, where adventure is just a roll away. The Dice Ball Podcast is a proud member of the D20 Radio Network. For more information about the network, visit www.d20radio.com. The Dice Ball Podcast is a fan-generated podcast. All of the information provided on the podcast and related website are not affiliated with Fantasy Flight Games or any of their licensed swords. The content of this podcast remains a property of the Dice Ball Podcast and is intended for educational and informational purposes only. The GeneSys Role Playing Game, the GeneSys logo, content, and all material remain the property of Fantasy Flight Games.
Yes.
Can you say your bit, please?
Oh. Don't you mean ghosts of the show?
Eerily, I do. Good work.
Can you leave that bit in? Just dead silence and then like me just going,
Oh, dear. And welcome to the core of the show, the segment.
whoa, cool.
It's the spooky episode. Oh, dear. I'll try that again, shall I?
You got to do it, but you have to do a accent like you're a vampire.
Really? You want me to do that?
Yes.
Yes.
So, welcome to the core of the show.
I regret my decision.
Oh my gosh, it sounds like Vlad is here with us
Oh, dear.
with his miniatures.
Right. So, you don't want me to do that now?
I keep doing it.
Right. Okay, excellent.
I was
Right.
injecting comedy.